Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around, we're going to do another Nail the Shot video, this time featuring this silhouetted giraffe at sunset with these little birds flying around him. This was captured on my last Africa trip, which was back in May, and I want to talk about kind of the situation around the shot, as well as some of the exposure challenges and focusing challenges that you have to think about when you're shooting a silhouette like this. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so this photograph was captured on one of my Botswana workshops earlier this year. And what had happened is we were on the Chobe River, we were in a boat. I had the workshop participants and my wife and I were there. And we were going along and we saw these giraffes. And it was maybe an hour and a half before sunset at this point. And we did some photographs of the giraffes where they were at the time. It was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. So we also noticed some other animals in the area, but we also couldn't help but notice that this had a lot of potential for a really good silhouette. So what are the criteria for a good silhouette? Well, you need three things. The first, you need a very distinctive animal, something that everybody who sees the photo is going to recognize instantly, and they're not going to wonder what this, black lump in the image is. With a giraffe, it's pretty obvious what we're looking at. So we get a check mark for box number one. Now, the second thing you need is a clean background. You can't have trees or other obstructions behind the animal because those are going to be black too. And instead of having a distinct outline of an animal, you're going to have a distinct outline of an animal intersected by a bunch of other stuff, and it's going to look like all one big blob form, and it's not going to work. So you need a clear background behind the animal with nothing but sky. Check box number two is checked. And finally, you need to be at a little bit lower angle. And since we were in the boat and they were up a little bit, we automatically had a nice low angle. So all of those things work together to make a really good silhouette. Now all we needed was to get the animal in position, have it stay there for an hour and a half, and when sunset came, we would be able to shoot it. And fortunately, that's exactly what happened. I was very surprised. I was just sure these things were going to wander away, but we had some giraffes there at sunset. There was two of them, and we were able to photograph back and forth. Now, obviously, in this case, I only have one. We never really got a chance to get both of them together in a really good way, but honestly, I am super grateful for this shot because it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that sometimes luck does play a good part in a good nature photo, a good wildlife photo. In this case, we have all those birds flying around there, and that was just an absolute fluke. But as I tell people, anyone who says that luck doesn't play any role in nature photography or wildlife photography would probably lie to you about other things too. So anyhow, moving on, let's talk about some of the challenges with shooting a silhouette. The first thing is exposure. Everybody sees a silhouette and they're like, how do you expose for that? It's actually not too hard. A lot of times, if the sky is taking up a good portion of the frame, the camera automatically sort of gets the exposure right. You don't really have to nurse it at all. I'm not that trusting in my gear though. So what I do is I meter off of the side of the sun without the sun in it. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to meter the sky area next to the sun, but I'm going to keep the sun just outside of the viewfinder. I'm going to take a meter reading off of that, zero it out because I want that to be middle tone. And that way, if the sun's in it, it'll render as it should, as brighter than middle tone. And it will definitely make anything in the foreground just turn jet black like we want for a silhouette. Now, obviously, you may have to fine tune this a little bit. If you want the sun not to clip too much, you might have to bring this down a little bit. But for the most part, that's a really good starting point, is just metering off to the side of the sun. The next thing you have to worry about, though, is autofocus, believe it or not, especially if you're shooting a mirrorless camera. Now, with the giraffe, super easy, because mirrorless cameras like vertical lines better than they do horizontal lines, at least as of this recording. We don't really have what we would call a cross-type sensor in most mirrorless cameras. It's better thought of as just a line sensor. So what that means is if there's horizontal lines, it can struggle a little bit. So one challenge that we sometimes have in Africa is silhouettes of elephants, because we have that horizontal back and it's very tempting to try to focus on that, but invariably the camera will struggle a little bit with that. So you want to pick a vertical line in this situation, which with a giraffe is easy because we have that big neck, and that's exactly where I focused. I also was using my Sony A1, the 200-600, and I was using the large spot area, and I was just focusing on the side of his head and neck area up there, kind of the vertical area there. Very, very easy. The camera locked on with no problem at all. We had some Z9 shooters in the boat. They too had zero problems with this giraffe locking on like that. So not a problem. Where we do, again, have problems was with elephants, but that's a different video. So one thing that really made a difference in this particular shot was using that 200 to 600 zoom lens, because what was happening is that as the giraffes were wandering around, sometimes they'd be closer, sometimes they'd be farther back, and sometimes as you were shooting, you wanted a wider crop or a tighter crop, because what we were doing, we were having the boat driver kind of move us back and forth in front of the scene so that we could get different compositions, and everybody in the boat obviously has a different perspective, so that perspective would shift back and forth as we would move the boat back and forth, so we all got a really nice variety of shots. Now, one of the things here that really was a key to this shot was that 20 frames per second. One of the things I talk about and kind of argue with people about a little bit sometimes is why I shoot 20 frames a second all the time, why I never throttle it down to 10 frames a second. And this is something that looks like an obvious use for 10 frames a second or 5 frames a second, right? It's a giraffe that's just standing there. Nothing else is happening. It's a sunset with a giraffe. However, the birds were the key. At 20 frames a second, I had one shot that looked like this. The other ones, the birds were just not in a good position compared to this one. And that's the big takeaway here, is that a lot of times when you're shooting static subjects, something unexpected happens. Most of the time, it's just an expression, like the animal suddenly opens its mouth or opens its eyes real wide, or gives you a funny look. However, you could also have other elements in the frame that come into play, like these ox pickers that were on his back and they flew out there, and we got him in a kind of a nice oval, like right between the giraffe and the sun. Very, very lucky. But again, a big part of the reason that I have this image is because when I saw it happen, I was at 20 frames a second. I just let it rip and I got one shot that looked like this. As for some of the other settings, I was wide open at f6.3. The 200 to 600 is really nice at 6.3. I have no problems shooting that lens wide open. 1/5000th of a second. I know that seems like a lot, but ISO was only 320, and I'm really glad I had that faster shutter speed, because when those birds were flying around, I was able to freeze them without any problem at all. So that worked out really well. Now, as that sun got lower, I dropped that shutter speed a little bit, but for the most part, I was pretty high throughout the whole shoot. I did not have stabilization on. There was no need for it in a situation like this because it was at 5,000th of a second. So I do try to shut that off if my shutter speed is fast enough. And finally, of course, we have to think about composition. And in this case, you can see what the original composition intent was, to have the giraffe kind of offset by the sun there. I always like images where I can kind of balance out the different elements in them and not have the subject necessarily always centered right up. So I had started with the idea of the giraffe here and the sun here, and that would be a very pretty photo. And then, of course, the birds flew, which made it all that much the better for me. So overall, even though it seems like it might be a difficult shot, it really wasn't that hard to pull off. And everybody on the boat ended up with some really nice photos of this giraffe at sunset as the sun was going down. So overall, it was one heck of an evening in Africa. So there you have it. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out all of my educational materials. I have all sorts of books and video workshops that are just chock full of information like you heard in this video. As always, make sure you sign up for my free email newsletter if you haven't already. That way you never miss one of these videos, one of my articles, or any of the announcements that I make. And as always, I'd love it if you would like, subscribe, and get notified. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.